A warm welcome to our friends and colleagues in Australia and warm wishes for your conference over the next few days. We are sorry we cannot be with you, but we are delighted that Sir Jim Rose and I can add some words as a contribution to the conference. Gillian Zucker has now run this conference on a number of occasions and is getting bigger and better every year. She has on her website links to some of the information that we will be referring to in our video today. I have Sir Jim Rose, who has for many years been a leading light in teaching with his inspectorate role at Ofsted and in various reports that he has written over the years. We couldn't ask for a better expert to talk to us about reading with his experience, both his personal experience and his professional experience. We hope you enjoy what we have to say, and we welcome any questions and queries that you might have afterwards. And now I would like to introduce Sir Jim Rose to you. For years we've been talking about standards of reading, comparing England with nations across the world. What would you like to say about that, Jim?
Well, I think we're not alone in the Western world, for sure, in taking full account of international comparisons from sources like the OECD assessments. We were really pretty down in the dumps about some of the standards which existed. For example, as far back as 1997, only 67%, I think it was, of our 11-year-olds reached our target for English. We introduced a national literacy strategy, and by 2005 there had certainly been some improvements, but still over 20%, or around about 20% of children were still not meeting the targets for English. We stalled around that level and probably are still really falling short of what we believe to be possible. I think this runs very much along the lines which Ken Rowe's review uncovered in Australia, and certainly the convergence between his report, his review and mine is very strong. Both countries, in fact, not just both, America for sure and others have conducted surveys or taken note of surveys of this kind, and they have given rise to a pretty relentless political drive to raise education standards overall, especially for disadvantaged children, where it seems there's a widening gap between the haves, as it were, and the have-nots. And this raised uncomfortable questions and issues about the quality of teaching and the quality indeed of teacher training. So despite various reforms to the curriculum and professional training, issues such as that remain bones of contention today. And that's given rise to a mantra which I think was coined in the OECD: no school can be better than its teachers. It seems almost too obvious to even think about, but in point of fact, that's, I feel, where we should always start. What actually is the quality of the teaching that we should realistically expect for all our beginner readers, whether we're talking about those who have got specific or so-called dyslexic issues or not?
And we'll come back to talk about teacher training presently. A question that has come in from Australia that we were hoping to discuss was, what do we have to say about definitions of dyslexia, which are prolific and diverse in their nature? And in your report, this was indeed your first job to come together with some consensus of a notion of what we in this country thought dyslexia was.
Well, we spoke about dyslexia basically as a word processing difficulty, and more of that in a second, with co-occurring difficulties. I think we've moved on. Remember, my report was produced in 2006, and certainly the world has turned very definitely. And we've got far more evidence now as to what the conditions are that give children problems when it comes to learning to read. One of the most productive, in my view at any rate, sources which we can now draw upon is what might be called, in fact it's the title of a very important book in this area, The New Science of How We Read, which of course is neuroscience. One of the key contributors to all of this is Stanislaus Dehaene. His book is called Reading in the Brain, The New Science of How We Read. And that assembles, and we haven't got time to go through all the subtypes, but that assembles a first-rate analysis of dyslexia. And even then he says that it's grown apace since he wrote the book, which I think came out in 2009. But he writes about the position in France, and it did seem to me that he was putting his finger on a number of points which are very general elsewhere. In France, he says, at least, an abundant variety of self-pronounced experts still propose a paraphernalia of non-scientific approaches and cures to dyslexia, while others, often from a psychoanalytic stance, deny that it even exists. So we're really, I suppose, in a position where we need to make sure that we are standing on what you might call evidence, for sure, research evidence. But another dimension to that is coming from a source which I found equally interesting, Bob Slaving and Success for All, where he talks about evidence-proven research. And I suppose the question that we could pose is, why doesn't some of the best research even get through the classroom door? And that's been an abiding problem for many years. But clearly, given the importance of making sure that all children benefit fully from the best professional knowledge and practice on the teaching of reading and supporting those with dyslexia, we need to beware of false prophets, but take on board, indeed, evidence-proven research. That is to say, research findings that have been subject to stringent evaluations as to their success in practice. Slavin and others certainly today advise that we need to make sure that there are 5 elements emphasised in particularly the USA 2000 National Reading Panel report. 5 elements that must be well taught. These are phonemic awareness, the shorthand being the ability to hear and identify individual sounds in spoken words. Phonics, the relationship between the letters of written language and the sounds of spoken language. Fluency, the capacity to read text accurately and quickly. Vocabulary, all the words students must know to communicate effectively. And of course, comprehension, the ability to understand what has been read and said. So let's just look at those again, just by way of headlines. Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. Most certainly, I think they should be banner targets for all those who are seriously interested in making sure that we have first-rate offerings for children, whether they are dyslexic or otherwise. Children in preschool and their first year of formal schooling, the panel found that early training in phonemic awareness skills, especially blending and segmenting, provided strong subsequent benefits to reading progress. It further recommended that conjoint phonemic awareness and phonics emphases should be taught directly rather than incidentally, and that's a very important point. In other words, effective instruction, direct instruction in both skills leads to strong early progress in reading and spelling.
One of the models we have found particularly helpful in teacher training has been the simple view of reading, which has been around for quite a while. And I would like you just to make some comments on that, as well as recommendations of where people can find out more about this simple model.
Well, we found the simple view of reading, in fact it's covered fairly extensively in my reading review, because we asked Professor Morag Stewart and Professor Rona Stainthorpe to draw together a view about the simple view of reading and how it could be helpful. And indeed, it's a conceptual construct, a framework, if you like, a very broad conceptual framework for distinguishing between two important interacting dimensions of reading. The two being visual word recognition processes and language comprehension processes. And it is important to understand the relationship between those two, and for teachers to understand just which of those two processes their teaching is contributing to. Word recognition processes are, I suppose, a major concern for us if we're thinking about dyslexic children, because that appears to be where the bulk of the issues, as far as their learning difficulties are concerned, reside. But if you take this view, it enables us to think about one or two other things as well. As you can see, this is portrayed on the diagram as four different elements. So we can look at word recognition. Let's just look at the line word recognition. Can be poor or good on a continuum, and language comprehension likewise on a continuum. And if we look at the subsections, we can arrive at these four positions where we would have children who possibly had good language comprehension and poor word recognition. Certainly we might be thinking there in terms of subtypes of dyslexia. We could have children who have got good word recognition and good language comprehension, and that of course is where we want them all to be. They can have good word recognition and poor language comprehension. That's a very interesting, seems to me, subset of itself that bears further investigation. But then, we have children who will have poor word recognition and poor language comprehension. And these, of course, are the ones probably of greatest concern that we need to give special attention to. But all of these subsets, I feel, need to be fully investigated and thought about in terms of what is common all children, wherever they are on that pattern, need, and what more can be done for those who clearly need additional support. Now, it's almost impossible to go through all this in detail, but I would recommend that we keep that particular structure in mind, but bear in mind also that I think Goff and Tunner, who developed this in 1986, and others have had far more to say about the model since it was first put forward. But it still, in my view, remains a very useful structure for determining what needs to be done when we're faced with groups of children which will obviously manifest these different outcomes.
It's certainly giving teachers a better explanation of why people may be poor readers, and also a signpost to the fact that remediation for one group would be quite different from another group.
Indeed.
And if you would like to hear Jim speak further about the simple view of reading, there is a link on Gillian Zucker's website where you can link into a webcast which gives you more information. I think too the advantage of this particular model is it clearly distinguishes dyslexic readers from other poor readers. And so going back to that definition, the query coming from Australia has been, should we call people dyslexic or should we just call them reading disabled? I think my view on that is it's good to differentiate because remediation will be different. I don't know what Jim's view is on that.
Well, I think, again, you know, we can't cover all this in a conversation today, but there's no doubt that the breakthroughs are coming from neuroscience thick and fast. I mean, the ways in which now it's possible to monitor the brain's response to reading are immeasurably better than they were even 5 years ago, and I suspect that this will continue to advance apace. But I would point you again to Dehaene, Stanislaus Dehaene. His book Reading in the Brain is still very good value, and he has got a very interesting, intriguing lecture up on the TED website, which is well worth pursuing. But I think that's one piece of reading which would enhance an understanding of what we're talking about with regard to dyslexia, because he talks about the subtypes from a neurological standpoint, and I think defends the term dyslexia very, very well. The simple view of reading is also extremely well explored in another book, Reading, Development and Teaching, by Morag Stewart and Rona Steinfeld, which was published this year, Sage Publishers this year, 2016, which we will obviously illustrate for you. And I do think it's worth returning to what Elliot and Grigorenko say in the dyslexia debate, their book. I don't agree with their conclusion, but what they have done is to uncover an enormous amount of useful research, and indeed they look at the contribution of neuroscience to diagnostics, and I think that's worth reading. It's a pity they didn't sort of follow through on what that actually means in Dehaene's terms for defining dyslexia.
One of the questions that Gillian has sent is, why is it that no one programme is suited to the varied needs of all dyslexics? So I thought maybe we could say a little bit more about synthetic phonics and for whom it is appropriate and for whom it may not be appropriate.
Yeah, this is a hard nut to crack, hardly needs to be said. But let's just run down some of the ingredients of synthetic phonics, and let's try and do it in non-jargon terms, as it were. First of all, beginners need to learn grapheme-phoneme correspondences in a clearly defined and incremental sequence. But it starts with very small steps. They discover from perhaps just 3 letters, ATP, which is where some of the original Clackmannanshire research started from, as it were, and quite a well-known synthetic phonics scheme early on continues to promote the 6 letters SATPIN as a starting point, because they give you the greatest number of monosyllabic words. But so in other words, starting very small, trying to establish the grapheme phoneme correspondences are as they are, sounding out and in fact putting them together to make words. So grapheme phoneme correspondences in a clearly defined incremental sequence, and then as we move on, in fact starting almost from the word go, applying the important skill of blending, synthesizing, which is at the heart of obviously synthetic phonics. Synthesizing phonemes in order all through the word to read it. Now these things seem so obvious, but it is important that these are established as the platform on which to move forward. And in my view, this needs to be done very, very thoroughly and make sure it is checked so that each child most certainly has been given ample time and practice to grasp what's going on. So all through the word reading, and then applying the skills of segmenting words into their constituent phonemes to spell. But spelling is different from reading and certainly from synthetic phonics in the way in which, in its sort of pared back form, it should be. They also, obviously, children need to learn that blending and segmenting are reversible processes. Now, are we confident in our teaching that these things are being offered in as clear and intensive fashion, and of course an interesting and engaging promotion, as it were, as possible? Because I do think that even now, it's possible to see that these things are probably not being done as thoroughly as possible for each child, whether they are suffering reading difficulties or not.
Certainly they are two sides of the same coin, and we have found at the Helen Arkell Centre we definitely may not get dyslexic people to perfect spelling, but by working on spelling we do improve their reading because they're noticing things much better than they would have done otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that is a consequence of the process. But I think the starting point, establishing that starting point, is extremely important. And that means time, doesn't it?
It does mean time. And that was exactly what I liked in your saying, that children need ample time to learn these connections. And where synthetic phonics may not work with many of our dyslexics is the pace of the programme, that they're rushing on to new signs when they haven't really established fluency with those initial ones. Looking at the 5 features that you talked about promoted by the National Reading Panel, you can see how these promote in synthetic phonics, phonemic awareness, phonics, and that time and reinforcement will reinforce fluency. And it's that fluency which will then feed into comprehension of the passage. One of the other questions we've had has been about giving extra time in things like exams or offering scribes or amanuenses to do the writing for children. And I know that this is really controversial in England, where people feel that some children are awarded extra time who may not deserve it, and other children who do deserve it don't get that extra time. Have you an opinion on that?
Well, opinion, I think it would have to be. I'm fairly agnostic about this, frankly, but it does seem to me, equality of opportunity really demands that we make sure, if the opportunities are available, to children make the best of themselves in any examination of a formal nature. So if it can be shown that that bit of extra time is indeed making a big difference to the performance of the child, then I think we ought to run with it. But I, would keep a question mark over how that's best achieved, and make sure that the professional judgments being exercised were as well informed as possible.
The extra time can be used for many things, reading the paper as well as writing.
Indeed.
As writing the answers. And I think one of the phrases that we use here is history of provision. If schools can actually keep records that demonstrate in that extra time they are able to do themselves more justice, I think that is a fairer way of doing things.
I mean, I suspect the issue turns a bit on unfair advantage.
Yeah.
Which, matter of judgment then, isn't it, really?
Okay. We'd like to highlight another article that we are hoping that Gillian Zucker will put on her website. It is written by Kerry Hempenstall, and it is produced in the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties. and I know that I'm going to be using it in the UK with teacher training here. It is excellent, it is up to date. To me, it shows to teachers exactly what to do with children that they may be concerned about in a cheap, efficient, time-effective way, so that rather than referring children for expensive and time-consuming assessments, these are things that they can do in the classroom in the very early stages to see what sort of remediation should be put in place as quality first teaching. And I'm very glad that Jim sent me this article. I will be using it, and I'm sure Jim has something more to add to what I've said already.
Well, I mean, Australia will be, I'm sure, aware of Kerry Hempenstal. His contribution and analytical skill when it comes to putting forward research is second to none in my view, and he's given us a really rich seam of articles over the years which I think contribute massively to thinking about this territory. This one, of course, has been around some time and updated, so I would thoroughly recommend. I mean, it is very substantial, but it really does deserve serious attention. And he's talking here about the range of assessment available now, which is amazing. But the important contribution is that he analyses the quality of it very effectively and draws on sources that we really do need to, I think, take account of. So yes, I think that hopefully Gillian will get this on the website, and people will be able to see it for themselves.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. We have looked at most of the questions that we've been sent by Gillian. We're happy to take queries in the form of emails and whatever format after you have watched this video. Please do come back to us if you need further references, but we hope that these will be added to the film and will be available on the Learning Difference Convention website. And I would like very much to thank Sir Jim Rose for his outstanding contribution to what we've been doing in England, and I hope we've managed to share him with our friends and colleagues in Australia.